Jake Thompson patrolled the predominantly black neighborhood with a sense of superiority, his eyes scanning the streets for any sign of potential criminal activity. His demeanor was tense, his hand resting on his holster as he walked down the sidewalk. The residents of the area noticed his presence, some averting their eyes, while others watched him warily. As he turned a corner, Jake spotted Malik Johnson walking down the street. Without any apparent reason, Jake decided to approach him. He quickened his pace, closing the distance between them. "Hey you, stop right there," Jake called out, his voice authoritative and harsh. Malik, dressed in a well-tailored suit, turned to face the officer. He remained calm, his posture relaxed as Jake reached him. "Is there a problem, officer?" Malik asked politely. Jake's eyes narrowed as he looked Malik up and down. "What are you doing in this neighborhood? You don't look like you belong here," he said, his tone accusatory. Malik took a deep breath before responding. "I live here, officer. I'm just walking home from work." Jake scoffed, clearly skeptical. "Yeah, right. Let's see some ID. What kind of work do you do that has you dressed like that in this part of town?" As Malik reached for his wallet, Jake's hand instinctively moved closer to his weapon. "Slowly," he barked, his suspicion evident in every word. Malik carefully pulled out his identification and handed it to Jake. The officer snatched it from his hand, examining it closely. "Johnson, huh? You sure this is real?" Jake's question dripped with disbelief and thinly veiled racism. "Yes, officer. That's my legal identification," Malik replied, his voice steady despite the growing tension. Jake continued his interrogation, his questions becoming increasingly hostile and racially charged. "What's someone like you doing living in a neighborhood like this? You dealing drugs or something?" Malik's jaw clenched, but he maintained his composure. "No, sir. I'm not involved in any illegal activities. I chose to live here because this is my community." Jake laughed derisively. "Your community? Please. People like you don't choose to live in places like this unless you're up to something." The officer's prejudice was on full display, his words revealing the deep-rooted bias in his training and worldview. He continued to press Malik with invasive questions, each one more insulting than the last. Throughout the encounter, Malik remained respectful but firm. He answered Jake's questions calmly, refusing to be provoked into an angry response that could escalate the situation. However, the strain of maintaining his composure in the face of such blatant discrimination was evident in the tightness around his eyes and the slight tremor in his hands. Jake, emboldened by Malik's calm demeanor, became even more aggressive in his questioning. He made snide remarks about Malik's appearance, suggesting that his clothes must be stolen or that he was impersonating a professional. Each comment was designed to demean and belittle Malik, to reinforce the officer's perceived superiority. As the interaction continued, passers-by began to take notice. Some slowed their pace, watching the scene unfold with concern. Others pulled out their phones, ready to record if the situation escalated further. The tension in the air was palpable, a stark reminder of the fraught relationship between law enforcement and the black community. Jake's behavior was a textbook example of racial profiling and police harassment. His unfounded suspicion, aggressive questioning, and demeaning comments all stemmed from a place of prejudice. He saw Malik not as an individual, but as a stereotype, a potential threat based solely on the color of his skin. This encounter highlighted the systemic issues within law enforcement, where officers like Jake felt empowered to harass citizens without cause. It showcased the daily reality for many Black Americans, who face unwarranted scrutiny and hostility from those sworn to protect and serve. As the confrontation continued, it was clear that Jake had no intention of backing down or admitting his mistake. His pride and prejudice blinded him to the reality of the situation, setting the stage for a dramatic revelation that would shatter his preconceptions and force him to confront his own biases. As the tense interaction continued, Malik decided it was time to reveal his true identity. With a steady voice, he said, "Officer Thompson, I believe there's been a misunderstanding. I'm Senator Malik Johnson, recently elected to represent this district." The effect of this revelation on Jake was immediate and profound. His face, previously set in a mask of arrogance and suspicion, suddenly drained of color. His eyes widened in shock, and his mouth opened and closed several times as he struggled to find words. "Senator?" Jake stammered, his voice losing all its previous authority. He quickly glanced down at the ID he was still holding, now seeing it with new eyes. The arrogance that had fueled his behavior moments ago evaporated, replaced by a growing sense of dread. Malik stood tall, his demeanor shifting subtly. While still calm, there was now an unmistakable air of authority about him. "Yes, officer. I was elected 3 months ago. I chose to continue living in this neighborhood because I believe in being close to the people I represent." Jake's posture changed dramatically. He straightened up, no longer looming over Malik in an intimidating stance. His hand, which had been resting near his weapon, now fell limply to his side. I didn't realize," he muttered, his eyes darting around as if looking for an escape route. "Clearly," Malik replied, his tone firm but not aggressive. "Now, would you mind explaining why you felt it necessary to stop and question me without probable cause?" Jake's face flushed with embarrassment and fear. He began to stammer out explanations, each one sounding weak even to his own ears. It's procedure to... We have to be vigilant in high-crime areas." Malik listened to Jake's fumbling attempts at justification with a steady gaze. "And what made you assume this was a high-crime area, Officer Thompson? What made you suspect me of criminal activity?" The questions hung in the air, forcing Jake to confront the racial bias underlying his actions. He shifted uncomfortably, avoiding Malik's eyes. "I didn't mean to. It wasn't personal. I was just doing my job." "Your job is to protect and serve all citizens, regardless of their race or the neighborhood they live in," Malik stated calmly. "What I experienced today was not protection or service. It was harassment based on prejudice." Jake's discomfort was palpable. He was no longer the confident, intimidating officer who had approached Malik. Instead, he looked small and uncertain, the reality of his actions and their potential consequences sinking in. I'm sorry, Senator," Jake said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to." Malik held up a hand, stopping Jake's apology. "Intent doesn't negate impact, Officer Thompson. What happened here today is a symptom of a much larger problem, one that affects countless citizens who don't have the protection of a Senate title." Jake nodded mutely, sweat beading on his forehead despite the cool weather. The gravity of the situation was hitting him hard. His mind raced with thoughts of disciplinary action, media scrutiny, and the end of his career. Malik continued, his voice level but intense. "I want you to understand something, Officer Thompson. I'm not going to let this incident slide, not for my sake, but for every other person who has faced similar treatment without the power to fight back." Jake's face paled even further at these words. What are you going to do?" he asked, his voice trembling slightly. "I'm going to ensure that this incident is properly reported and investigated," Malik replied. "I'll be speaking with your superiors, and I'll be pushing for a broader examination of policing practices in this precinct." The promise of action left Jake in a state of panic. He began to plead, his earlier arrogance completely gone. "Please, Senator, I have a family. This job is all I have. I never meant to." Malik remained unmoved by Jake's pleas. "Actions have consequences, Officer Thompson. It's time for you and the system you represent to face those consequences." As Malik turned to leave, Jake stood rooted to the spot, the weight of his actions and the uncertain future ahead bearing down on him. He watched as the man he had wrongly profiled and harassed walked away with dignity, leaving him to grapple with the realization that his deeply ingrained biases had just altered the course of his life. The encounter ended, but its repercussions were only beginning. Jake was left to face the stark reality of his prejudices and the flawed system he was a part of, while Malik moved forward, determined to use this experience as a catalyst for change in his community and beyond. In the weeks following the incident, Senator Malik Johnson wasted no time in addressing the issues of police misconduct and racial profiling. He called for a public hearing on abuse of power and racism within the police force, drawing significant attention from both the media and the community. The day of the hearing arrived, and the large auditorium was packed to capacity. Citizens from all walks of life filled the seats, their faces a mix of anticipation and concern. The air was thick with tension as Malik took his place at the podium, ready to open the proceedings. "Good morning," Malik began, his voice strong and clear. "We are here today to address a systemic problem that has plagued our community for far too long. What happened to me was not an isolated incident, but a symptom of a much larger issue." As Malik recounted his experience with Officer Jake Thompson, a hush fell over the room. He described the unwarranted stop, the aggressive questioning, and the palpable prejudice he faced. His words painted a vivid picture of the encounter, bringing many in the audience to nod in recognition of similar experiences. "But this isn't just about me," Malik continued. "It's about every person who has ever been unfairly targeted, harassed, or brutalized by those sworn to protect and serve. Today, we will hear from members of our community who have lived through these experiences." One by one, citizens stood up to share their stories. An elderly woman spoke of her grandson being roughed up during a routine traffic stop. A young man recounted being thrown against a wall and searched without cause while walking home from work. A mother, her voice trembling with emotion, described her terror when her unarmed son was held at gunpoint by police in their own backyard. Each story added to the growing narrative of systemic abuse and racial bias. The room was filled with a mixture of anger, sadness, and determination. Some audience members wiped away tears, while others nodded grimly, their own experiences mirrored in the words of their neighbors. As the testimonies continued, Jake Thompson sat in the back of the room, his face a mask of discomfort and shame. He had been ordered to attend the hearing by his superiors, who were scrambling to address the public relations nightmare his actions had sparked. Finally, it was Jake's turn to speak. He walked to the podium, the weight of hundreds of eyes upon him. The room fell silent, the tension palpable as he cleared his throat. I'm here to explain my actions on the day I encountered Senator Johnson," Jake began, his voice wavering slightly. "I was doing what I thought was my job. I was trained to be suspicious, to look for potential threats." His words were met with murmurs of dissent from the crowd. Malik leaned forward, his gaze fixed on Jake, waiting to see how the officer would address his behavior. Jake continued, his discomfort evident. "I now realize that my actions were based on unfair assumptions and prejudice." He paused, swallowing hard. "I'm here to take responsibility for my actions and to apologize." The audience's reaction was mixed. Some nodded in appreciation of his admission, while others remained skeptical, calling out for more than just words. Malik stood up, addressing Jake directly. "Officer Thompson, your actions that day were not just a personal failing, but a reflection of a larger systemic issue. How do you propose we address this problem within the police force?" Jake fumbled for an answer, clearly unprepared for such a direct question. I'm not sure. Maybe more training? Better screening of officers?" His uncertain response only fueled the crowd's frustration. Calls for more concrete action and accountability filled the room. As the hearing continued, it became clear that Jake's testimony while a step towards acknowledgement, was far from sufficient to address the deep-rooted issues at hand. The community demanded more than apologies. They wanted real change, accountability, and a complete overhaul of the system that had allowed such abuses to persist. The hearing concluded with Malik promising further action and investigation into police practices. As the crowd dispersed, the air was charged with a mix of emotions: hope for change, anger at past injustices, and determination to see real reform. Jake left the auditorium, his head bowed, the weight of the day's testimonies and his own actions heavy on his shoulders. He knew that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult process, not just for him, but for the entire police force and the community they served. In the days following the public hearing, Jake Thompson found himself in a state of internal turmoil. The testimonies he had heard from community members had shaken him to his core, forcing him to confront the reality of police brutality and systemic racism in a way he never had before. Sitting alone in his living room, Jake replayed the stories in his mind. The pain in the voices of those who had suffered at the hands of law enforcement was undeniable. He thought about the young man who described being thrown against a wall for no reason, the mother terrified for her son's life, and the countless others who had experienced similar trauma. For the first time, Jake began to see beyond his own perspective and truly empathize with the community he had sworn to protect. As he grappled with these new realizations, Jake's phone buzzed with notifications. News outlets were covering the hearing extensively, and social media was ablaze with discussions about police reform. Jake's name and face were prominently featured in many of these reports, making him the poster child for police misconduct in the eyes of the public. The pressure was mounting from all sides. His colleagues at the police department were divided. Some supported him, claiming he was just doing his job, while others distanced themselves, not wanting to be associated with the controversy. His superiors were demanding explanations and assurances that he would not further damage the department's already tarnished reputation. In the midst of this storm, Senator Malik Johnson made an unexpected move. After the hearing, he approached Jake, offering an opportunity for a private conversation. "Officer Thompson," Malik had said, his voice firm but not unkind, "I believe that real change starts with understanding. If you're willing, I'd like to sit down and talk about what happened and how we can move forward." Jake was taken aback by the offer. Part of him wanted to accept immediately, seeing it as a potential lifeline in the chaos. But another part, the part still clinging to his old world view, hesitated. Accepting Malik's offer felt like admitting defeat, like conceding that everything he had believed about policing was wrong. As Jake wrestled with this decision, the media coverage intensified. Reporters camped outside his house, hoping for a statement or reaction. His phone rang incessantly with calls from journalists seeking interviews. The constant scrutiny was suffocating, making Jake feel increasingly isolated and defensive. At work, things weren't much better. Jake found himself assigned to desk duty, away from patrol and public interaction. His fellow officers treated him with a mix of sympathy and wariness, unsure of how to act around him. The station, once a place where he felt confident and in control, now felt hostile and alien. The pressure continued to build. Community activists called for Jake's dismissal from the force, arguing that his actions were inexcusable. Police unions defended him, claiming that he was being unfairly targeted and that the incident was being blown out of proportion. Jake found himself caught in the middle, unsure of where he stood or what he believed anymore. As the days passed, Jake's resistance to change began to crumble. The weight of public opinion, combined with his own growing doubts, was becoming too much to bear. He started to question not just his actions on that fateful day with Malik, but his entire approach to policing. Late one night, unable to sleep, Jake revisited the idea of meeting with Malik. He realized that continuing to resist and defend his actions was only causing more harm. to himself, to the community, and to the possibility of real change. With a heavy sigh, he picked up his phone and composed a message to the senator, accepting his offer to talk. As he hit send, Jake felt a mix of fear and relief. He knew that this conversation with Malik would be challenging, forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about himself and the system he was part of. But he also felt a glimmer of hope that through this dialogue, he might find a way to make amends and contribute to positive change. The response from Malik came quickly, setting a time and place for their meeting. As Jake prepared himself mentally for the conversation ahead, he realized that this could be a turning point, not just in his career, but in his understanding of his role in society and the true meaning of justice and protection for all. In the weeks that followed, Senator Malik Johnson and Sophia Martinez, a respected local activist, joined forces to organize a series of community events aimed at promoting police accountability and fostering dialogue between law enforcement and residents. These gatherings, held in community centers and local parks, quickly gained momentum, attracting diverse crowds eager for change. Jake Thompson, still grappling with the aftermath of the incident, initially resisted attending these events. The thought of facing the community he had wronged filled him with anxiety and shame. However, as the pressure from his superiors mounted and his own conscience nagged at him, he reluctantly decided to participate. On a warm Saturday afternoon, Jake found himself walking into a bustling community center. The room was filled with a mix of local residents, activists, and a few of his fellow officers. As he entered, he could feel eyes turning towards him, some curious, others hostile. Jake's instinct was to turn and leave, but he forced himself to stay, finding a seat at the back of the room. Malik and Sophia stood at the front, welcoming everyone and explaining the purpose of the gathering. "We're here to listen, to learn, and to work together towards a safer, more just community for all," Malik stated, his voice carrying authority and compassion. As the session began, community members started sharing their stories. Jake listened, his discomfort growing with each account of police misconduct and racial profiling. A young woman described being pulled over repeatedly for no apparent reason. An elderly man recounted how his grandson was roughly handled during a stop-and-frisk incident. Each story chipped away at Jake's defenses, forcing him to confront the reality of systemic racism in policing. Sophia facilitated the discussion, ensuring that all voices were heard. She skillfully managed the tension in the room, creating a space where people felt safe to express their fears and frustrations. Jake watched her, amazed at her ability to navigate such emotionally charged conversations. As the session progressed, Jake found himself deeply moved by the stories he heard. The pain and fear in people's voices were undeniable. He began to see the community not as potential threats to be controlled, but as individuals with their own lives, families, and aspirations, individuals who had been hurt by the very system he represented. Towards the end of the meeting, a young black teenager stood up. His voice trembling slightly, he addressed Jake directly. "Officer Thompson, I've seen you around my neighborhood. I've always been scared when I see cops, but especially you. You always looked at us like we were criminals. How can you justify treating people like that? How can we ever trust the police?" The room fell silent, all eyes turning to Jake. He felt his heart racing, his palms sweaty. This was the moment he had been dreading, yet somehow knew was necessary. Taking a deep breath, he stood up. I can't justify it," Jake began, his voice unsteady. "I was wrong. I've been wrong for a long time. I thought I was doing my job, protecting people, but I was causing harm. I'm here because I want to change. I want to learn how to be better, how to truly serve and protect everyone in this community." His words hung in the air. Some people nodded, while others remained skeptical. The young teenager who had asked the question looked at Jake, a mix of surprise and cautious hope in his eyes. Malik stepped forward, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder. "This is why we're here," he said, addressing the room. "To have these difficult conversations, to acknowledge mistakes, and to work together towards real change." As the meeting concluded, Jake felt emotionally drained, but also lighter somehow. He had taken the first step towards redemption, towards becoming the kind of officer he should have been all along. Sophia approached him as people were leaving. "That took courage," she said, "but it's just the beginning. Are you willing to keep showing up, to keep listening and learning?" Jake nodded, a sense of determination replacing his earlier anxiety. "Yes," he said, "I'll be here. I want to make things right." As he left the community center, Jake knew that the road ahead would be long and challenging. But for the first time since the incident with Malik, he felt a glimmer of hope. He had seen a path forward, a way to be part of the solution rather than the problem. With each step, he was moving towards becoming the kind of officer his community deserved, one who truly protected and served all people, regardless of their race or background. Over the next few months, Jake became a regular attendee at the community meetings organized by Malik and Sophia. Each session challenged his preconceptions and deepened his understanding of the issues facing the community he had sworn to protect. He listened intently to stories of racial profiling, police brutality, and systemic injustice, gradually shedding his defensive posture and opening himself to genuine change. As Jake's involvement grew, so did the tentative bonds between him and the community members. While many remained wary, some began to appreciate his efforts to learn and improve. Jake found himself engaging in conversations he never would have imagined before, discussing police reform with activists and sharing his own evolving perspectives with fellow officers who were curious about his transformation. One evening, during a particularly intense meeting, a heated debate broke out about the role of police in schools. Jake, drawing on his new understanding, spoke up. "I used to think a strong police presence in schools was necessary for safety," he admitted. "But now I see how it can create a hostile environment, especially for students of color. Maybe we need to rethink this approach entirely." His words, spoken with honesty and humility, resonated with many in the room. Malik, observing from the sidelines, nodded approvingly. Jake's willingness to question and challenge the status quo was a significant step forward. As the community engagement initiative gained momentum, Malik and Sophia decided to organize a peaceful march to raise awareness about police reform and racial justice. The event was planned meticulously, with a focus on fostering unity and promoting dialogue. When Jake heard about the march, he felt a mix of emotions. Part of him wanted to participate, to show his support for the cause he had come to believe in. But another part feared the reactions of his colleagues and superiors. After much internal debate, he made his decision. On the day of the march, Jake arrived in civilian clothes, his heart pounding as he joined the growing crowd. He spotted familiar faces from the community meetings, receiving nods of recognition and a few surprised smiles. As the march began, Jake found himself walking alongside people he once viewed with suspicion, now united in a common goal. The atmosphere was charged with energy and hope. Chants for justice and equality filled the air as the diverse group of marchers made their way through the city streets. Jake, initially feeling out of place, gradually relaxed, buoyed by the sense of purpose that surrounded him. As they approached the city hall, where the march was set to conclude, Malik took the stage to address the crowd. His powerful voice carried across the gathered masses, speaking of a future where law enforcement and communities work together in true partnership. "We are here today, not to condemn, but to create," Malik declared, "to build a system of justice that truly serves all people, regardless of their race, background, or zip code. This is not just a march. It's a movement towards a more equitable and just society for everyone." Jake listened, moved by Malik's words. He felt a surge of emotion. a mix of shame for his past actions and hope for the future he could help create. As Malik's speech concluded to thunderous applause, Jake found himself joining in, his voice blending with those around him. The energy of the event lingered long after the crowds dispersed. Jake walked home, his mind racing with new ideas and perspectives. He realized that his journey of change was far from over, but for the first time, he felt genuinely proud of the direction he was heading. The next day, as Jake prepared for his shift, he made a decision. He would speak to his superiors about implementing some of the ideas discussed at the community meetings. It wouldn't be easy, and he knew he might face resistance, but he was determined to be a catalyst for change within the department. As he put on his uniform, Jake caught his reflection in the mirror. The face looking back at him was the same, but the person behind it had fundamentally changed. He was no longer just an officer enforcing the law. He was becoming an advocate for justice and equality within the system he once unquestioningly defended. With a deep breath, Jake headed out, ready to face the challenges ahead. He knew that true change would take time and persistence, but he was committed to the journey, one step at a time. As the movement for police reform gained momentum, Senator Malik Johnson's efforts caught the attention of national media. His work in bridging the gap between law enforcement and the community became a model for other cities grappling with similar issues. Recognizing the impact of their initiatives, Malik and Sophia decided to organize a large-scale event, a rally focused on police reform and community empowerment. The day of the rally arrived, and the city's Central Park was transformed into a sea of people. Thousands gathered, holding signs demanding justice and equality. The atmosphere was electric, filled with a sense of hope and determination. Malik stood on the stage, preparing to address the crowd, his presence commanding attention even before he spoke. Jake Thompson, now an active participant in community engagement efforts, arrived at the rally in civilian clothes. He felt a mix of anticipation and nervousness as he made his way through the crowd. Many recognized him, some offering nods of acknowledgement, others still regarding him with cautious skepticism. As Malik began his speech, the crowd fell silent. "Today, we stand united in our demand for change," he began, his voice resonating across the park. "We're here to say that true safety comes not from force, but from understanding, respect, and equal justice for all." Jake listened intently, feeling a surge of emotion as Malik's words echoed his own journey of transformation. The senator spoke of a new vision for policing, one that prioritized de-escalation, community engagement, and accountability. As the speech neared its conclusion, Malik made an unexpected announcement. "We have with us today someone who embodies the change we're fighting for," he said. Officer Jake Thompson, once known for his controversial actions, has become an advocate for reform within the police force. "I'd like to invite him to share his perspective." Jake froze, caught off guard by the invitation. He hadn't prepared to speak, and the thought of addressing such a large crowd filled him with trepidation. But as he looked around at the expectant faces, he knew this was a crucial moment. With shaky legs, Jake made his way to the stage. As he approached the microphone, he could feel the weight of thousands of eyes upon him. Taking a deep breath, he began to speak. "A few months ago, I was part of the problem," Jake started, his voice trembling slightly. "I acted out of bias and fear, causing pain to the very community I was sworn to protect. But standing here today, I want to tell you that change is possible. It's not easy, and it requires constant effort, but it's necessary." As Jake continued, sharing his journey and his commitment to reform, he could see the crowd's reaction shifting. Some faces softened, while others remained guarded. He spoke of the need for systemic change, for better training, and for a complete overhaul of police culture. Just as Jake was concluding his impromptu speech, his phone buzzed in his pocket. Instinctively, he glanced at it and saw a message from his superior. "Thompson, stand down. Do not engage further in this event. "Report to the station immediately." Jake's heart raced as he read the message. He was at a crossroads: follow orders and potentially undermine the progress he'd made, or stand his ground and face the consequences. The choice he made in this moment would define not just his career, but his integrity and commitment to change. Looking up from his phone, Jake saw Malik watching him intently, as if sensing the internal struggle. The senator's eyes conveyed a silent question. "What will you do?" Jake took a deep breath, his mind racing. The crowd waited in anticipation, unaware of the drama unfolding on stage. In this crucial moment, Jake had to decide where his true loyalty lay: with the old system he was trying to change, or with the new path he had committed to walking. The tension was palpable as Jake stood there, the weight of his decision hanging in the balance. Whatever choice he made would have far-reaching consequences, not just for him, but for the entire movement he had come to believe in. In that pivotal moment, Jake made his decision. He pocketed his phone, turned back to the microphone, and continued speaking, his voice growing stronger with each word. "I just received an order to stand down and leave this rally," Jake announced, causing a ripple of murmurs through the crowd. "But I can't do that. I won't do that, because the change we're fighting for is more important than any order, any job, or any personal consequences I might face." The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Jake's decision to prioritize his newfound principles over his career resonated deeply with the assembled masses. Malik, standing nearby, nodded in approval, a look of respect and admiration on his face. Jake continued, his voice filled with emotion and conviction. "I want to apologize, not just for my actions against Senator Johnson, but for every time I've let bias guide my actions as a police officer. I've been part of a system that has hurt and marginalized communities of color for far too long, and I'm here to say, no more." As Jake spoke, he could see a mix of reactions in the crowd. Some were moved to tears, while others remained skeptical. But there was an undeniable energy in the air, a sense that they were witnessing a genuine moment of transformation. "I commit to you today," Jake said, his voice rising, "that I will work tirelessly to change the system from within, to challenge my fellow officers to confront their biases, to advocate for better training, and to hold those who abuse their power accountable. This isn't just about me or any individual officer. It's about reimagining what public safety truly means." As Jake concluded his speech, the crowd's response was overwhelming. The applause was deafening, punctuated by shouts of support and encouragement. Even those who had been skeptical of Jake's presence seemed moved by his candor and commitment. Malik stepped forward, embracing Jake in a powerful moment of unity. The image of the senator and the officer, once adversaries, now standing together as allies in the fight for justice, was a powerful symbol of the change they were working towards. As they embraced, Malik whispered to Jake, "That took real courage. Are you ready for what comes next?" Jake nodded, a mix of determination and apprehension in his eyes. "I have to be. There's no going back now." The rally concluded with a renewed sense of hope and purpose. As the crowd began to disperse, many approached Jake, some to shake his hand, others to share their own stories or express their cautious support. However, not everyone was pleased with Jake's actions. A small group of counter-protesters, mostly fellow police officers and their supporters, had gathered at the edge of the park. They shouted accusations of betrayal and disloyalty, their anger a stark reminder of the challenges that lay ahead. As Jake left the stage, he was immediately approached by several of his superiors, their faces stern and disapproving. "Thompson, you're suspended pending a full review," one of them said gruffly. "Turn in your badge and gun." Jake complied without argument, understanding that this was just the beginning of the consequences he would face. As he handed over his badge, he felt a strange mix of relief and trepidation. He had crossed a line, but it was a line that needed to be crossed. Malik, observing the scene, approached Jake as the other officers walked away. "You've taken a big step today," he said, placing a hand on Jake's shoulder. "It won't be easy, but you're not alone in this fight. We'll stand with you." As they walked away from the rally together, Jake and Malik knew that this was just the beginning of a long and difficult journey. The road ahead would be fraught with challenges, but they had taken a crucial step towards real change. The image of the senator and the former officer, walking side by side, became a powerful symbol of hope for a community long divided by mistrust and injustice. In the weeks following the rally, Jake Thompson found himself at the center of a storm. His suspension from the police force sparked intense debate within the department and the wider community. Some officers viewed him as a traitor, while others, inspired by his courage, began to quietly question their own practices and beliefs. Malik, true to his word, stood by Jake throughout the tumultuous period. He used his position as a senator to push for a fair and transparent review of Jake's case, arguing that punishing an officer for speaking out against systemic racism would only perpetuate the problems they were trying to solve. Seizing the momentum generated by the rally, Malik and Sophia expanded their efforts. They launched a series of police reform initiatives, including enhanced training programs focusing on de-escalation techniques, implicit bias recognition, and community engagement. Jake, despite his suspension, became an integral part of these programs, sharing his experiences and insights with both officers and community members. One of the most significant developments was the creation of a civilian oversight board designed to investigate complaints against police officers and ensure accountability. Malik fought hard to push this through legislative channels, facing stiff opposition from police unions and conservative politicians. Jake, meanwhile, threw himself into community work. He volunteered at local youth centers, participated in neighborhood watch programs, and continued to attend and speak at community meetings. His presence was often met with mixed reactions, but over time, more and more people began to see the sincerity in his efforts to make amends and drive change. As the date for Jake's disciplinary hearing approached, tension in the city mounted. Supporters rallied behind him, organizing peaceful demonstrations and social media campaigns with hashtags like "Stand with Jake" and "Reform Not Punish." On the other side, those opposed to his actions called for his permanent dismissal from the force, arguing that his behavior at the rally was insubordination and a betrayal of his oath. The day of the hearing arrived, and the police department headquarters was surrounded by a sea of protesters and media. Inside, Jake faced a panel of senior officers and city officials. He spoke eloquently about his journey, the realizations he had come to, and his commitment to being part of the solution. "I stand by my actions," Jake said firmly. "I believe that true loyalty to the badge means standing up against injustice, even when that injustice comes from within our own ranks." The hearing lasted for hours, with testimonies from community members, fellow officers, and expert witnesses. Malik himself spoke on Jake's behalf, emphasizing the importance of fostering a culture where officers felt empowered to speak out against misconduct and bias. As the hearing concluded, the panel announced that they would need time to deliberate before reaching a decision. The city held its breath, waiting to see how this pivotal case would be resolved. In the meantime, Malik used the heightened public interest to push forward with his reform agenda. He introduced a comprehensive bill in the state Senate, proposing sweeping changes to police training, accountability measures, and community engagement protocols. "What we decide in the coming weeks will shape the future of policing in our state," Malik declared in a passionate speech on the Senate floor. "We have an opportunity to lead the nation in reimagining public safety, to create a system that truly serves and protects all members of our community." The bill sparked intense debate, with supporters hailing it as a necessary step towards justice and opponents arguing that it would hamper law enforcement's ability to do their job effectively. As the arguments raged on, all eyes remained on Jake's case. seen by many as a litmus test for the department's willingness to embrace real change. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, the decision regarding Jake's future with the police force was announced. The anticipation was palpable as Jake, Malik, and a room full of journalists and community members gathered to hear the verdict. The chief of police stepped forward, his face grave as he prepared to deliver the news that would have far-reaching implications for Jake, the police department, and the entire community's fight for reform and justice. The chief of police cleared his throat, the tension in the room palpable as all eyes focused on him. After careful consideration of all evidence and testimonies, we have reached a decision regarding Officer Jake Thompson's status within our department, he began, his voice steady but tinged with a hint of resignation. Officer Thompson's actions, while in violation of direct orders, have shed light on deeply rooted issues within our police force. In light of this, and considering his commitment to reform, we have decided not to terminate his employment. A collective gasp rippled through the room, followed by a mix of cheers and murmurs of discontent. The chief continued, "However, Officer Thompson will be demoted and required to undergo extensive retraining. He will also serve as a liaison between the department and the newly formed Civilian Oversight Board." As the announcement settled, the room erupted into a cacophony of reactions. Supporters of Jake celebrated the decision as a step towards accountability, while others argued it wasn't severe enough. Jake himself stood silently, a complex mix of emotions playing across his face. Malik, who had been watching intently, stepped forward to address the gathering. "This decision, while not perfect, opens the door for real change," he said. "But our work is far from over." Just as the commotion began to settle, a journalist in the back of the room stood up. "Senator Johnson, I have information that might be relevant to this case," she announced, her voice cutting through the noise. "My sources have revealed that Officer Thompson wasn't the only one involved in discriminatory practices. There's evidence of a widespread culture of racism and cover-ups within the department." The room fell silent as the journalist continued. "I have documents showing that several high-ranking officers were aware of and even encouraged the type of profiling that led to your encounter with Officer Thompson, Senator." This bombshell revelation sent shockwaves through the gathering. The chief of police, visibly shaken, demanded to see the evidence. Malik, his face set in grim determination, turned to address the crowd. "If these allegations are true, they confirm what many in our community have long suspected," Malik said, his voice resonating with controlled anger and resolve. "This is no longer about one officer or one incident. We are looking at a systemic failure that demands a complete overhaul." In the days that followed, the leaked information dominated headlines. As promised, Malik used his position as a senator to push for a comprehensive investigation into the police department's practices. The scope of the inquiry expanded, looking into years of complaints that had been dismissed or buried. Jake, though relieved to keep his job, found himself in a difficult position. As more information came to light, he grappled with the knowledge that he had been part of a much larger problem. He made the difficult decision to cooperate fully with the investigation, providing insider information that proved crucial in uncovering the extent of the misconduct. The fallout was significant. Several high-ranking officers were suspended or forced to resign. The police chief, unable to deny his role in perpetuating the toxic culture, stepped down. The department was placed under state oversight, with a mandate to implement sweeping reforms. Malik's police reform bill, bolstered by the new evidence, gained widespread support. It passed with a strong majority, ushering in a new era of accountability and community-oriented policing. As for Jake, he found himself in a unique position. Though demoted, his willingness to speak out and change made him an invaluable asset in the department's reformation efforts. He worked closely with the Civilian Oversight Board, helping to bridge the gap between the police and the community. The road ahead was long and challenging. Changing entrenched systems and attitudes would take time and persistent effort. But as Malik stood before the press, flanked by Jake and community leaders, there was a palpable sense of hope. "Today marks a new beginning," Malik declared. "We have exposed the rot that has long plagued our justice system, and now we have the opportunity to build something better. It won't be easy, but together, we can create a model of public safety that truly serves and protects all members of our community." As the cameras flashed and the crowd cheered, Jake and Malik exchanged a look of mutual respect and determination. They had come a long way from that first confrontation, and though the journey ahead was uncertain, they were committed to seeing it through, for themselves, for their community, and for the hope of a more just and equitable future.